From fights over whether nursing home deaths deserve an investigation, to tracking down COVID scams, to putting a non-compliant restaurant owner in jail, Michigan's Attorney General is a fixture in the headlines. Dana Nessel is here to talk about it all. And a freshman congressman from Michigan who seemed to jump right into the Washington fire. Our first Flashpoint conversation with Representative Peter Meijer. Today is Easter Sunday, April 4th, 2021, and this is Flashpoint.
Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. A very happy Easter to you and yours. I'm delighted you're spending this Sunday morning with us. And safe and warm inside is probably the best advice again, as we've watched COVID cases jump by an alarming degree. This past week, Michigan showed more recent cases per capita than any other state, and that after such a promising decline in cases. Now, with more seniors having had the vaccines, the cases are skewing younger, and exhausted healthcare workers are right back in the swale. Against that backdrop, there is a lot of misinformation that keeps making the rounds on social media, and more than a few scammers who see, of course, a lot of opportunity in the crisis. That's just one of the matters begging the attention of Attorney General Dana Nessel. From Line 5 to Flint Water, from U.S. gymnastics to demands from GOP lawmakers, and that doesn't include the recent comments about her from the state's Republican chairman. The Attorney General will join us in just a moment. And a little later on, our first conversation with one of the new members of the Michigan congressional delegation. Peter Meijer quickly ran afoul of many fellow Republicans in voting to impeach President Trump after the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Well, now he has President Biden's massive infrastructure bill to consider. Way too expensive to most of his colleagues, and yet a lot built into it for Michigan's automakers. We'll talk to him, too, all today on Flashpoint. Well, let's assume Dana Nessel's desk has been reinforced with steel braces and supports, lest it collapse beneath the weight of the many issues facing the Attorney General. Very good to have Dana Nessel back with us again on Flashpoint. Attorney General Nessel, it's always good to have you. I want to, off the top, let's quickly dispense with Ron Weiser's recent comments. He referred to you and Governor Whitmer and Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson as witches. Now, he has apologized for what he said, though that is not enough for those who want to see him resign from the U of M Board of Regents, including his fellow regents, as of Friday morning. He says he's refusing to be canceled. So let me let you react to what's happened.
Well, Devin, first of all, thanks for having me. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not a matter of being canceled. It's being held accountable for your words and words that inspire very dangerous actions. And what we've seen from the Michigan Republican Party as of late, and this is not just from Ron Weiser, but also from his co-chair, Michonne Maddox, you know, this dehumanization and demonization of their political opponents. So calling us witches, calling us the three-headed monster, calling us evil. Those types of statements allow others to act in a manner that actually is dangerous for the three of us and for all elected officials when we talk about assassinating people, when we talk about burning people at the stake. It's never appropriate to talk about one's political opponents in these terms. And I think it's important to understand that when people hear that, there are some people who then see that as a call to action. And why wouldn't you take up arms against someone who you've described now as evil? I mean, you're doing a society a favor, I guess, by taking us out. I mean, that's what leads to the rise in domestic terrorism in this nation. And we have seen this movie before, right? And we know that, in fact, in the case involving the plot to kidnap and execute the governor, that these individuals reappropriated the exact same language that we heard Donald Trump using about our governor in their effort to, you know, what they had hoped to be a murder plot. And so it's very dangerous language. And I think it's so important that elected leaders, party leaders, not engage in that kind of very hateful and angry rhetoric.
It really speaks to how fraught our political discourse has become, and that leads me into our next topic. You've got a lot of GOP lawmakers not so much asking as demanding that you investigate the governor and the state of Michigan's nursing home policy through those first early months of the pandemic. I guess there's two problems for a prosecutor's office, and that would be allowing someone to talk you into investigating something out of of political malice. But I guess the other problem would be not investigating something out of political fealty. Tell me a little bit about how you're approaching this and why Republicans are wrong in their request.
Well, first of all, my job as a prosecutor has to be completely nonpartisan. So if you look at my track record, for instance, I have investigated and in many cases prosecuted a lot of notable Democrats in the state, including the Southfield city clerk and the Macomb County prosecutor. I investigated the governor when asked to do so last year in terms of the contact tracing contracts. So I'm not afraid to investigate members of my own party. But when it comes to this particular event, the problem is this. There is just no evidence of any kind that there was any sort of criminal activity. And when I've asked over and over again for Republicans to give me even a prima facie case of anything the governor did that, in fact, was criminal in regard to a policy that we know was never actually implemented, they're unable to do so. So how does that allow me as a prosecutor, just cause to mount an investigation when there's no indication of any kind that there was a crime that was committed?
There are some, though, who draw a similarity between this and the Flint water case, where you have an acting administrator, a governor, who maybe with the best of intentions, nonetheless bears responsibility for what happens further down the line from those decisions. How would you draw a distinction between those two cases?
Well, I think there are many distinctions, but let me say this. When I entered office, remember that Attorney General Bill Schuette had already launched an investigation and, in fact, had charged over a dozen people. So I inherited this investigation. I inherited all of these cases. Now, not to say that Attorney General Schuette was in the wrong for having launched that investigation, but when I came into office, that investigation was already well underway.
True, but I don't think you've taken issue with it.
Well, to be fair, I was not part of the investigation. Just so it's clear, there's a conflict wall, and I was not involved in any way, shape, or form with the investigation or the prosecutions on account of me having handled, of course, the civil cases. Right. So I'm unable to say specifically what evidence exists or doesn't exist, except for what I read in the papers, which is the same thing, of course, that you and the media report on. Yeah. But I will say that those are very different incidences. In terms of what occurred in Flint, I mean, this was obviously a man-made disaster that didn't have to happen. COVID, on the other hand, is a global pandemic. And what we know is that the numbers in Michigan were not different from the numbers in other states as it impacted our nursing home population. And that's one of the things that, of course, I really struggle with in determining, even if this policy had been implemented, that it was a bad policy to begin with, because we just haven't seen that borne out by the statistics. So to me, to launch this investigation, again, with no indication of any criminal activity whatsoever, that in itself would be partisan.
Is Pete Lucido barking up the wrong tree and going ahead with his own investigation, or is that within his rights as county prosecutor in Macomb?
While I would say, of course, that he's an independently elected office holder with prosecutorial authority, it bothers me a lot to see someone say, I don't have any evidence of a crime. Please, people, bring me some sort of evidence that would allow me to move forward with an investigation. That's not normally how it happens. What happens when you're a county prosecutor is, generally speaking, you have law enforcement who have had reports of some sort of criminal activity. They then bring it to the county prosecutor, who reviews it. They, of course, can ask for further investigation before they authorize or deny a warrant. But it's very unusual to start with the prosecutor and to say, bring me evidence of a crime when you don't already have any of it. And I think it's very telling, of course, that Lucido himself has indicated that he can't execute any search warrants. Why? Because he doesn't have probable cause that any crime existed.
To carry them out. I've got a number of issues I want to get to here in just the couple minutes that we have left. First off, let's stay with the pandemic. You have been, in fact, you've done some great videos trying to help older Michiganders not getting scammed, but this is becoming a massive problem in the middle of the pandemic, these scams.
It absolutely is. And it's been a problem for quite some time. And unfortunately, our seniors are the most vulnerable population to fall victim to them. And what I had planned before 2020 had other plans for me and for everyone was to do a series of consumer protection town halls all around the state to inform seniors about these pernicious scams that have robbed individuals in our state of hundreds of millions of dollars. But of course, I couldn't do those in person. So I thought the best way possible to let people know about them was through a series of videos that we are continuing to film. But, it's very important that people pay attention, that people understand what spoofing is, that, anything can come into your phone or onto your computer that looks like it's from a legitimate source that isn't, and that you never, ever provide your personal information to someone when you don't even know who you're talking to. It's very dangerous. The other thing I'd love to tell your viewers about is a new division in our office where we are dedicated to assisting those who have been victims of identity theft to help people rebuild their credit. It is such an arduous, difficult process.
Yes.
And while, of course, we can always prosecute people and try to get restitution for them once they have been victimized, and we do that all the time, millions of dollars a year that we are able to reimburse people, we would prefer that people never become victims in the first place.
I got to make sure I get to USA Gymnastics. You've got a number of parents and people who've watched around this program very upset that the investigation kind of reached a dead end. I sense that you also have some frustration, but at the end of the day, you weren't able to get around the law to get Michigan state leadership to be able to testify the way you wanted them to. Is that it in a nutshell?
Well, essentially, in 2018, the Board of Trustees for Michigan State University actually requested that the Department of Attorney General do an investigation and get to the bottom of everything that occurred involving the Nassar scandal. And instead, what they ended up doing was to stonewall our investigation. So they kept some 6,000 or more emails from the Department of Attorney General that did not allow us to complete our investigation, despite the fact that they are the ones that asked for it in the first place. And yes, those emails are protected by attorney-client privilege.
Right.
But if you weren't going to cooperate with the investigation, why ask us to do it in the first place? It's really disturbing.
I've only got 30 seconds left. Can you make any comment right now on what's happening with Line 5 now that the Canadian government has said that this is not arguable? We have to have that line in place.
Well, I think that's absolutely untrue. And I have every reason to believe that the governor and I are going to be successful on this matter in court. And in doing so, we'll save Michigan from potentially the worst catastrophic oil spill in American history.
We will talk about that further. That deserves an entire program on its own. Attorney General Nessel, it's always good to have you back on the program. Thanks so much for the time. Stay safe. We'll talk to you again soon.
You too. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Back with more. We'll talk with Congressman Peter Meijer next on Flashpoint on Local 4.
Have you lost your healthcare plan due to a job loss or layoff? Or need to buy your own health coverage because you're self-employed? With an individual health plan from Priority Health, you'll get a lower price than with the market leader. Most people qualify for a government subsidy. Our Michigan-based enrollment specialists are ready to help see if you're eligible for a subsidy and just how much you can save. Call now for a free quote.
This is not just a mask. It's a bridge to better days. The path back to togetherness and protection for those we love. So until we all get the COVID-19 vaccine and build community immunity, which will take time, stay careful, mask up, and social distance. Spread hope, not COVID.
William Hill Sportsbook. Download today and let's make it interesting with a risk-free bet of up to $2,021.
Monday morning at 6:30, see how these dedicated teachers overcame the challenge of providing special education virtually.
I was terrified, and I just asked the parents, I said, I'll give you grace if you give me grace.
And even discovered a silver lining.
Some things they found that worked very well, they'd like to keep around forever.
I think that is my favorite part about all of this, and I hope we can find some way to keep that going.
Watch Monday on Local 4 News Today.
Michigan sent 2 Republican freshmen to Congress in the last election. We've spent some time with Lisa McClain from District 10. Let's spend some time this morning in District 3, the other side of the state, with Peter Meijer, who arrived at a historic moment in Washington and was getting national attention for breaking with most of his GOP colleagues on impeachment. Very good to have Congressman Peter Meijer with us today on Flashpoint. Congressman, happy Easter.
Happy Easter. Thank you for having me on.
You bet. I want to start with whether or not, given the 3 very turbulent months that have marked the start of your congressional tenure, have you had any misgivings or second thoughts? We've had all kinds of political calamity, of course, but then you've also got security problems. We just saw another one this past Friday. Have you had any misgivings about what you decided to take on?
Oh, none at all. I think there were some folks who got to D.C. and with the events that were unfolding in January said, you know, what the heck am I doing here? And there were others, and then I count myself in this group, who said, we feel that we're exactly where we need to be. And then my background's in the military, humanitarian aid, and disaster response. So having spent about 3 years between Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm no use to dicey situations. Definitely didn't hope to see that in Washington, but you know, it's times like those when you need to have, you know, calm heads that can prevail.
You also, though, arrive at a time when there is great upheaval within your party. You, of course, you've already got opponents lining up, Republican opposition lining up for an election against you that's 2 years away. And I guess some see that there is a fight for the soul of the GOP right now. Kind of tell me a little bit about your thoughts about where the GOP is headed.
Obviously, for both the country and also the Republican Party in particular, we've been through a trying period of trying to just understand what it is the party stands for. Are we a party that is a party of ideas that is trying to be in a position to earn the trust of the public to be governing? Or are we one that, you know, feeds off of outrage and anger and focuses on emotion rather than on action, on performance rather than on getting things done? So I have obviously cast my lot in believing that the Republican Party could be one that can govern this country, that can lead forward with conservative principles and solutions to the problems that are facing our country today. But there's obviously a lot of folks who might beg to differ.
You, among your first 2 big votes to face you in Congress are the question of whether or not you want to sign 2 very big checks. Let's start with the coronavirus and pandemic relief bill, the stimulus bill, that I think to some people's way of thinking worked out perfect for the Republicans because they got to vote against it, and yet their constituents ended up getting the money because this bill was pretty popular with the American people, according to the polling.
Yeah, well, when the polling all says, do you like checks? People are going to say yes. Now, I was frustrated that the direct cash payments, which I strongly supported, were such a small fraction of this bill. I'm a member of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus group. It's 58 members, 29 Republicans, 29 Democrats. Yep. We had tried to rush through $160 billion for vaccines, testing, and PPE. And the Democratic majority wouldn't let us. We were trying to front load that. I offered a counter proposal that could have increased the checks by $1,000 to $2,400, maintained a lot of the same essential components, but still came in $1 trillion short. So at the end of the day, I mean, that was a sweetener on a package that was filled with things that had nothing to do with the pandemic. It was an appropriations omnibus package that was, you know, hidden under the guise of COVID relief and stimulus. And we're going to be paying for it for years to come. It's
been really interesting watching the debate over whether or not all of this was there too much waste in this that didn't have anything to do with the pandemic, because some would argue that it's really hard to point to any part of American life that hasn't been impacted by the pandemic.
Absolutely. You know, that was the justification some used for including, you know, bridge construction in northern New York State or infrastructure in the San Francisco Valley. You could make that excuse and rationalization for $83 billion to help bail out multi-state, multi-employer pension plans. But the reality is that none of those were directly tied. And especially when the rhetoric from the White House is we have to pass this package to reopen the schools, you know, holding our kids' education and future hostage in order to get what I would argue are, you know, I say unrelated. You can maybe make a very tenuous connection somehow, but certainly things that have nothing to do with addressing the emergency facing this country today, nothing to do with, very little to do with the vaccination program rollout that is essential, very little to do with supporting our small businesses so they can reopen. So much of this package was around multi-year appropriations, many of which didn't have any bearing on the actual crisis we're facing today.
Well, you paved the road there pretty well between the infrastructure components of that bill and the next package that I want to talk about, and that's President Biden's infrastructure plan. Bill Maher last week made what I thought was a pretty profound observation, that while China is building dams, we're arguing over who we should name them after. I think that we've all talked and given a lot of lip service to how America's infrastructure is falling apart, and yet when it comes time to pick up the tab for it, no one's really willing to do that. Give me your thoughts on this massive infrastructure plan.
Yeah, right now we're seeing a lot of very round numbers that I don't fully understand how they were arrived at. If you look back at the American Rescue Plan, the only reason why I can figure it was 1.9 trillion as opposed to 1.8 or 2.1 was because you could run right up to that number without saying it's trillions. It was just avoiding a plural. When it comes to the package that the Biden administration is proposing on infrastructure, again, it's 100 billion for this, 100 billion for that. I think we're spending more on electric vehicle subsidies than actually on highway and road improvements. I drive an electric vehicle. I like electric vehicles. But again, I want to actually be having these metrics be correlated to actual returns and outcomes. And you talk about China. I mean, one of the biggest differences between our investment in the US and other countries around the globe is they are killing us on getting things built quickly.
Yeah.
If you look at the cost per mile of the New York City subway, there's no reason why it should be 4 times Rome, London, Paris. I mean, every single thing we try to build is so beset by process permitting and other regulatory constraints that we never actually build what we're trying to do. And it takes decades to get something done that should only take a year or two.
It's fair to talk about the efficiency of the spending, but to say that we're going to fix America's infrastructure without a tax increase or without paying something more somewhere along the line seems foolish, doesn't it? I mean, if I own a car, even if I've paid it off, somewhere along the line, it's going to be time for a tune-up. It's going to be time for a new engine. There's a lot of upkeep that costs money.
Oh, absolutely, and that's why you should have user fees. Right. I mean, that's one of the things that I think we forget. And one of my deepest frustrations with how our government is financed is we kind of throw a bunch of money in and then draw a bunch of money out. What we're drawing out is invariably going to be more than what we're putting in, but very little of it's correlated to paying for the things that are being used on a daily basis. I mean, that's how you get an effective program, is the revenue that's generated goes towards paying off that investment. And that's where you actually can be connecting how something is performing. Now, one of the things that frustrated me about the plan, and again, we're just getting some vague details right now, a lot of that's going to get meted out in negotiations, but that there was a split between physical infrastructure and what they were loosely terming human infrastructure. To your point to our earlier conversation on the American Rescue Plan, I mean, I guess you can start to stretch the word infrastructure beyond, things that we can touch, travel on, our rails, our roads, our bridges and tunnels, to encompass the most nebulous concepts. And at that point, I mean, are we even talking about infrastructure to begin with? And that's where just, again, these otherwise very palatable and politically popular things become distorted beyond any possible comprehension and just an excuse to ram through priorities that are entirely unrelated.
It was really interesting that Republicans are again finding their bearing around the national debt, which grew precipitously under President Trump, and we didn't hear as much talk about, for instance, tax cuts without attendant spending cuts. Before I let you go, I want to make sure that I also let you weigh in on Ron Weiser's comments this past week. We talked earlier in this half hour to Dana Nessel. He also mentioned you and Fred Upton in his screed against fellow Republicans in your case. What are your thoughts about his remarks and whether or not he should continue as the state chairman of the party?
Well, I certainly have been outspoken in my belief that we need to turn down the heat on our political rhetoric, that we need to be focusing on solutions and not just giving into this negative polarization that has really come to define both parties. You talk to many Democrats on why they're Democrats. It's not because they love the Democratic Party. It's because they're fearful of Republicans and Republican governance. And then the same thing about Republicans. I mean, we've become parties that are identified not by what we believe in, but by what we're viscerally opposed to. And I don't think that's how we're going to move forward as a country. I think if we're spinning in circles trying to criticize each other, we're not moving forward. And we're going to get left in the dust by the countries around the globe who are able to harness the collective energy of their people in a common direction. So I'm very supportive of what we can do, and this is what I try to exemplify in DC is I have no issue saying where I disagree with the Democrat, but that's going to be rooted around, my belief in what policy outcomes will actually achieve a better state for the American people, rather than personal attacks and trying to demonize.
Really good to have a conversation with you this morning, Congressman. I hope it's the first of many. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Deb. Take care.
We'll take a quick break. Back with more on Flashpoint right after this.
Hi, I'm David Hall, and now is the time to refinance your home loan. Take years off your loan, lower your payment, consolidate some debt. Hall Financial's ready to help you achieve your goals. Don't miss out on historically low rates. Go to davidhallmortgage.com.
The tournament is in full swing and the field is shrinking. Who has the drive to march on to the next round? The choice is yours with this can't miss offer. Bet $1 on any team to advance. Win 100 if they do. It's that simple. As they move closer to cutting down the nets, you can be closer to collecting that cash. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app. Bet $1 to win 100 on any matchup and make it rain.
This is your moment. Your I can see the doctors I know moment. Your I've got options I can trust moment. Your I get to choose moment. This is your moment to get healthcare coverage with access to a large nationwide network. With Ambetter, you have access to the doctors you need when you need them right in your area. Get started at enrollambetter.com or call 855-680-3355.
I want to quickly talk about something we mentioned earlier. These are the videos that we talked about with Attorney General Nessel. I highly recommend them for anyone who is struggling with scams or misinformation during this COVID pandemic. You'll find them on her social media pages. Meet the Press is next. See you next time on Flashpoint.